You are standing in the open, and it is -10 degrees. There is no fire, there is no shelter, there is no jacket because jackets have not been invented yet. Your body is losing heat right now, faster than you can generate it, and in about 2 hours, if nothing changes, you will be dead. Not from a predator, not from starvation, just from the cold itself, quietly shutting your body down, organ by organ. This is not a hypothetical. This is Tuesday, for one of your ancestors, at some point in the last few 100,000 years. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Fire is actually a fairly late addition to the human survival toolkit, at least in terms of reliable, portable, everywhere-you-go fire. For a huge stretch of our evolutionary history, humans were pushing into cold climates, freezing climates, ice age climates, without the guaranteed ability to make fire on demand. So the question isn't really, how did ancient humans survive winter? It's, how did a hairless, tropical origin primate survive an ice age without dependable fire? And the answer is stranger and more impressive than you'd think. Let's deal with the obvious problem first. Humans are, biologically speaking, a warm climate animal. We evolved in East Africa. We have almost no fur compared to other mammals our size. We don't have a thick layer of blubber like a seal. We don't hibernate like a bear. By every reasonable measure, we are one of the worst-equipped large mammals on the planet for surviving cold. A wolf has fur built for snow. A mammoth has a coat and a fat layer built for the Arctic. A human, standing naked in the snow, has essentially nothing. This is sometimes called the naked ape problem, and it's a genuine puzzle for anthropologists. How did a species this poorly adapted to cold end up colonizing Siberia and northern Europe and the Arctic Circle tens of thousands of years before modern medicine, synthetic insulation, or central heating existed? The first part of the answer is fire, obviously, and fire deserves credit. But here's the detail that gets skipped over constantly. Making fire from scratch, with hand drills or flint and pyrite, is hard. It's slow. It fails constantly in wet or windy conditions, which, if you're picturing an Ice Age winter, is exactly the conditions you'd be dealing with. Anthropologists who've studied fire starting with primitive methods report failure rates that would be catastrophic if fire were your only line of defense against freezing to death. Which means ancient humans almost certainly weren't relying on fire alone. They were relying on a fire, plus a stack of backup strategies that modern people have almost completely forgotten existed. The first of those strategies is the one hiding in plain sight. And it's not clever technology, it's fat. Specifically, human babies and to a lesser extent adults carry something called brown adipose tissue, brown fat, which is metabolically different from the regular white fat most people think of when they hear body fat. Brown fat's entire job is generating heat directly, by burning through stored energy without producing movement. It's essentially an internal furnace. Modern adults have very little of it, but researchers studying populations that regularly experience extreme cold, including some Arctic and Siberian groups, have found elevated brown fat activity compared to populations from consistently warm climates. This isn't something you consciously control. It's a slow evolutionary and developmental adaptation, built over generations of bodies that needed to generate heat internally, from the inside out, without lifting a finger. The second strategy is one that's been staring at us from cave walls for over a century, and somehow people still don't talk about it enough. Clothing. Not the modern idea of clothing, fashion, style, seasonal collections, but clothing as a survival technology. Arguably one of the single most important inventions in the entire human story. Here's a detail that tends to surprise people. Archaeologists can't directly find ancient clothing very often, because animal hide and plant fiber rot away almost completely within a few centuries. So how do we know when clothing started? Through an incredibly clever piece of detective work involving lice. Human head lice and human body lice are genetically distinct species, and body lice, specifically, can only survive in clothing. They need fabric to live in. Geneticists studying the DNA divergence between head lice and body lice have estimated that body lice split off as their own species somewhere around 170,000 years ago, which means, indirectly, that's roughly when humans started wearing clothes regularly enough for an entirely new species of parasite to evolve to live in them. Let that sit for a second. We know when humans invented clothing, partly because of when a species of bug started living in our clothes. And this timing matters enormously, because 170,000 years ago lines up almost perfectly with humans beginning to push into colder regions of Africa and eventually out of Africa entirely. Clothing wasn't a fashion choice. It was the technology that unlocked entire continents. The clothing itself, once we get archaeological evidence for it directly, turns out to have been remarkably sophisticated. Sites in Russia dating back over 30,000 years have produced bone needles with tiny eye holes, evidence of actual sewn, fitted garments, not just draped animal hides. Fitted clothing traps a layer of warm air against the skin, which is a completely different and far more effective strategy than simply wrapping fur around your body. Some of the most famous Ice Age burials in Russia, at a site called Sungir, include bodies covered in thousands of ivory beads arranged in patterns that mirror the seams of tailored clothing, shirts, trousers, even boots, all of which have since decomposed, but whose shape is preserved in the position of the beads that were sewn onto them. Ancient humans in Ice Age Russia were wearing tailored trousers and boots roughly 34,000 years ago. Not fur draped over the shoulders like a cartoon caveman, actual sewn, layered, fitted winter clothing. The materials mattered too. Researchers studying traditional Arctic clothing, both ancient and among more recent groups like the Inuit, have found that certain furs are dramatically better at insulation than others. Caribou fur, for example, has hollow hair shafts that trap air with extraordinary efficiency, giving it an insulating capacity that some modern synthetic materials still struggle to match. Ancient humans figured this out through trial and error, generation after generation, learning which animals produced which furs, and which furs kept you alive and which didn't. Now let's talk about shelter, because standing in the open in fitted clothing is still eventually a losing battle against an Ice Age wind. Ancient humans built structures specifically engineered against cold, and some of the evidence for this is honestly staggering. At sites in Ukraine, archaeologists have discovered structures built almost entirely from mammoth bones, dating back over 15,000 years. Ribs, skulls, and tusks arranged deliberately to form a dome-like frame, likely then covered in hides for insulation. Building a shelter out of the skeleton of an animal that could weigh 6 tons is not a casual afternoon project. It represents planning, cooperation, and an enormous amount of accumulated practical engineering knowledge passed down across generations. Beyond dedicated structures, ancient humans across cold environments consistently used a specific trick that modern people rarely think about: going underground, or at least partially underground. Digging shelters partially into the earth, or building against a hillside, takes advantage of a basic thermal property most people never consider. A few feet below the surface, ground temperature stays remarkably stable year-round, regardless of what's happening above ground. Semi-subterranean pit houses, found across cold climate archaeological sites from Siberia to North America, use exactly this principle. You're not just blocking wind, you're borrowing warmth directly from the earth itself. Group sleeping arrangements did an enormous amount of the remaining work. This is a detail that gets almost no attention, but it's genuinely one of the most efficient heat preservation strategies available to a group with no central heating. Human body temperature runs around 37 degrees Celsius, and a sleeping group of people, packed closely together in an enclosed space, generates a meaningful, continuous heat output purely as a side effect of being alive. Ethnographic studies of traditional societies in cold climates have documented extremely close group sleeping, sometimes an entire extended family, or even multiple families sharing one small enclosed space, specifically because the shared body heat measurably raises the ambient temperature inside the shelter. It's a strategy so effective that some researchers have half-jokingly called it the original central heating system, except the heating units were each other. Diet played a bigger role in winter survival than most people assume, too. Cold exposure dramatically increases the body's caloric needs, sometimes by well over 1,000 calories a day compared to a warm climate, just to maintain core temperature. Ancient humans in cold environments compensated with diets extraordinarily high in fat. Arctic populations, both ancient and more recent, have historically consumed diets where fat can make up 50% or more of total caloric intake, from blubber, marrow, and fatty meat. This isn't a modern low-carb trend rediscovering something new. It's the ancestral, biologically necessary response to an environment where burning fat for warmth wasn't optional. Bone marrow specifically became a critical winter resource, an extremely dense, calorie-rich food that could be extracted even from the carcasses of animals that had already been picked over by other predators, giving ancient humans a crucial fallback food source during the leanest, coldest months, when hunting success dropped dramatically and plant foods disappeared almost entirely. Here's where the story gets a little more psychologically interesting, and it's something anthropologists have started paying much closer attention to in the last few decades. Surviving winter wasn't only a physical challenge, it was a social and cognitive one. Winters in Ice Age environments often meant weeks or months of confinement, in relatively small groups, in relatively small spaces, with limited food, limited light, and essentially nothing to do except wait for conditions to improve. Some researchers argue that this seasonal confinement is where a huge amount of early human cultural development actually happened. Long stretches of forced downtime, with nothing but each other for company, appear to correlate with increased tool refinement, more elaborate art, and more complex storytelling traditions in the archaeological record. Winter, in other words, might not have just been survived. It might have been one of the engines that pushed human culture forward, because when you can't go outside and you can't do much of anything else, you talk, you tell stories, you make things, and some of those things turn out to change the trajectory of an entire species. And we do have to be honest about the failure rate here, because glossing over it would be dishonest. Winter almost certainly killed a significant number of ancient humans, particularly the very young, the very old, and anyone unlucky enough to be caught away from shelter when conditions turned. Cold exposure remains lethal today, even with modern medicine, and it would have been dramatically more dangerous with none of the safety nets we currently take for granted. The strategies covered here, fat, clothing, shelter, shared body heat, high-fat diets, cognitive and social adaptation, weren't a guarantee. They were the accumulated best attempt of a species that was fundamentally not built for cold, refining its survival odds generation after generation through trial, error, and an enormous amount of loss along the way. What's remarkable when you step back is how little of this involved fire directly, even though fire obviously helped enormously whenever it was available. The real answer to how ancient humans survived winter without guaranteed fire is that they built an entire overlapping system, a body that could generate its own heat, clothing engineered specifically for insulation, shelters that borrowed warmth from the earth itself, groups that pooled body heat as a survival strategy, and diets specifically shaped around the brutal caloric math of staying warm. No single piece of that system was enough on its own. All of it, stacked together, refined over hundreds of generations, was enough to push an essentially tropical, nearly hairless primate into some of the coldest, harshest environments on the planet, and somehow come out the other side. Every time winter comes around now, and you complain about the walk from your car to your front door, somewhere in the deep background of your biology is a species that did this without a car, without a front door, and most of the time, without even a guaranteed fire.